First of all, tonight I'm going to talk about two things before we get going with discussing the chapters. But the first is the Battle of Blair Mountain, and the second thing will be a little bit more about the opioid crisis. So let me just, why is that not going when I click it? Yep, there we go. Okay, so the Battle of Blair Mountain that took place in 1921. And if you recall, Mr. Armstrong talking to Demon's class got talking about the Coal Wars and how this got going. And so there's a picture from the Battle of Blair Mountain. It is the largest labor uprising in American history. It was the largest armed uprising since the Civil War. 10,000 armed coal miners versus about 3,000 lawmen and strike breakers battled it out. They used Gatling guns and machine guns. Over 1 million rounds were fired in this battle, and they actually used airplanes and dropped some old gas canisters and things from World War I down on them, trying to stop it. When the Army troops, the federal troops, finally came into this conflict, it ended it because the miners had no quarrel with the federal government, and they would not fire in the troops because so many of them had served in the war. And so they felt that that was not something they wanted to do. And of course, the term redneck came from the miners wearing red bandanas to identify themselves during the battle. And Mother Jones, you'll see a picture in the next slide. She was an Irish labor leader who was apparently known to have quite the foul mouth. She waved a fake telegram from President Harding trying to stop the slaughter, saying that she had, was going to be able to end this. And so here you can see in the pictures, this top left here, or as I'm looking, I'm put my pointer at, there's a Gatling gun right there. They've got lined up with these two guys. This is Mother Jones down here talking to the group. And then this is an encampment of the people during the battle. And so what caused this whole uprising? Okay, well, first of all, coal companies controlled everything: housing, food, tools. So when you came to work for a coal company, they put you in the home they owned. You bought food from their store. They leased you tools from their tool department. Everything you had came from the coal company, and you weren't paid in cash. You were paid in what was called scrip, was used rather than money, so that this scrip could only be used at the coal miner's store. So when they would give you a raise or a pay increase, they just charge more for their goods. So you didn't really get a pay increase. So if they said, you're getting $100 in scrip a week, and we'll up to 125, they just move everything up in their own store. So the pay raise was negligible and never really happening. And then the other thing was cribbing was a common practice. So when they loaded the coal cars, they got paid by each coal car they could load. So 2,000 pounds was what a coal car should hold. But what they would do is construct the coal car so they'd actually hold 2,500 pounds, but you'd only be being paid for 2,000. So every car they filled, they get a 500-pound extra bonus without paying you for it. And then, of course, safety was a huge concern. Soldiers in World War I had a better survival rate than the miners do. And the United Mine Workers rallied the strike, and they were trying to organize them during this after what was called the Mattawan Massacre and the shooting of Hatfield and Chambers on the courthouse steps. So a little bit about the Mattawan Massacre. So in 1920, prior to this huge big Blair Mountain battle, Sheriff Hatfield, who was one of the people who was shot, and the mayor, Testerman, okay, the coal companies had been trying to stop them from unionizing in this part of West Virginia, and they did not want any unions to form. So they brought in this group called Baldwin Felts agents, who are sort of notorious for doing the dirty work of the coal companies, and they started evicting families from their homes. So the sheriff and the mayor went into where they were evicting families and said, show us your warrant, show us your right to throw these people out of their homes. And the Baldwin Felts agents had like a fake court order saying, well, we have a court order. So the Baldwin Felts agents, the head of that, John Felts, and the sheriff got into an argument over, I'm arresting you. No, I'm arresting you. No, I'm arresting you. And it turned into a gunfight. And at the end of this gunfight, 7 agents, the mayor, and 2 townspeople were dead. And so that's what the Mattawan Massacre was. So following that, Sheriff Hatfield and Chambers, another person involved in it, they came to the courthouse to stand trial for it. And when they got there, at the top of the courthouse stairs were the Baldwin Felts agents, and they just shot them dead. in front of the courthouse. They just pulled out their guns and shot the sheriff and Chambers dead on the courthouse steps. So this is what started that entire uprising at Blair Mountain. And so there's lots of information about this. If you go on YouTube, you can actually see a short YouTube video about it. But this was a huge, huge labor event. And it was unfortunate because the coal miners really didn't come out very much further ahead with it, due to the fact they obviously weren't going to fight against federal troops. But it was an unbelievable event. And then next up about the opioid crisis, I'm starting with two quotes from the book. So on page 243, June is talking to her father and Mr. Pegg and saying, absolutely no chance of getting dependent on this medication. The company did all kinds of studies, which for those of us who sort of know how this turns out, forget the book, we all know how the opioid crisis turns out. And of course, she's dating Kent, who works for the pharmaceutical company. And then on page 245 says, stronger than anything ever made, not the usual stuff you have to take every 4 hours. This one lasts around the clock. For the first time in years, you'll get a good night's sleep. And of course, if you recall, they give a coupon to the Peggs, to Mr. Pegg, saying, he's going to feel great. And Mrs. Pegg, when they get in the car, tears it up and throws it out the window and says, don't get involved with this. So a little bit about opioids by the number. 70,630 people died from drug overdoses in 2019. 10.1 million people in 2019 misused prescription opioids in that year. 1.6 million people had an opioid use disorder in the past year. 2 million people used methamphetamine in the past year, just in comparison to the number using that. 745,000 using heroin. 50,000 people using heroin for the first time. 1.6 million people misused prescription pain relievers for the first time. 14,480 deaths attributed to overdosing on heroin in a 12-month period ending in June of 2020. And 48,006 deaths attributed to overdosing on steroids after a methadone period ending in June 2020. So these are a little more current. So this next one is a little bit more about where we've been in rural West Virginia. So in the time period of the book, between 1997 and 2003, polydrug deaths increased 300%. So that's a huge amount between 1997, 2003. And when they say polydrug deaths, that's mixing drugs. Okay, so predominantly of this review, 57% of these were from the medical examiner's cases. Of those, 74% prescription opioids. Antidepressants mixed in there, 49%, benzodiazepines, 39%, all more prevalent than any illicit drugs. 2/3 of the decedents were 35 to 54 years old, 37% female. When compared to West Virginia metropolitan cases, polydrug abuse was more common, specific medication combinations were found, and the death rate per population was higher. Fewer illicit drugs were detected. These rural prescription overdose deaths differ from urban illicit drug deaths, suggesting the need for different strategies in prevention, treatment, and intervention by clinicians and policymakers. So, I don't want to belabor the opioid crisis because I think everybody's pretty well aware of it. If you have not read Dope Sick by Beth Macy, it's a nonfiction book on the opioid crisis in Southwest Virginia, the very area we're talking about. And if you don't want to read the book, it was made into a mini series, Dope Sick, on Hulu with Michael Keaton is in it. It's a terrific series. It's heart-wrenching, and this is all a true story about the Purdue Pharmaceutical Company. And you see it both from how it was affecting the towns of West Virginia, how similar to in the book, which we'll get to later, but how the pharmaceutical representatives and doctors worked to addict everybody and telling them there was nothing wrong with it. And then from the, Purdue family just trying to make as much money as they could and cover up everything as fast as they could. So that's just a little taste of that before we get going on tonight's reading. So we'll stop the share here.
Thanks, Julie.
Okay, and we can get on to talking about the book.
Okay, so once again, I'm going to say, do you have particular questions that you've thought of or particular observations that you've made that you'd like to share first? Because, I've got a bunch of questions, but I'd rather hear from you.
Not really a question.
All right.
I went to their wedding. I had an employee that wife was her second marriage, and um, she got hooked. Well, she was hooked on opioids, oxy specifically, that she got from physicians, prescription drugs, and they lasted about, I don't know, 6 years or so, and she'd be fine for a while, and then she'd forget whether or not she took her medication, and she'd take more, and then she'd take more, and she'd forget more. I found out after I retired that she died around 2020 of an overdose. But
Mm, mm.
it it drove my employee crazy. And she was a nice woman when she was not under the effects. But
Yeah, I mean, I think,
I've had personal experience. That's all.
yeah, I mean, my ex-wife is just had rotator cuff surgery, and she is on oxy.
Well, so am I, but I'm on chemo.
Okay, all right, yeah, and for her, she's just, she's sort of battling, I guess, the uncertainty because she's fearful, obviously, of what could happen. You know, uh, and but that's a reality. All right. Well, I have two quiz questions for you. And the person who answers correctly will get a table slap. I've cleared the dining room table adequately to do so. Now I'm going to move the glass over so that doesn't fall. Okay. At one point, Mr. Armstrong is, we learn his first name. It's Lewis. And my question is, and of course, Demon is saying, well, he was named after Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. How I don't get this Lewis thing. The answer that or the question that I'm asking is, why was he named Lewis, and whom was he named after?
Well,
It,
I didn't look it up, but I think that was his original name before he took Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. I remember that way back when. And I'm not sure that was the name, but I'm pretty
you're
sure
right.
that was his
No,
original name.
his name was Lou Alcindor.
Lou Alcindor.
Lou
Lou
That's
Alcindor was
right.
his original name.
Right. You gotta,
Having just watched High Society, I don't want to jump in if somebody else can get it, but I know who Louis Armstrong is.
I just hear it's age. I was around and aware then, so
well,
I just can't remember the name.
there's not much to be said for age, but that's one of them, you know. Okay, here's the second one. Now, my former students may well have encountered this term, and I'll give you a huge hint. It's this book could definitely be called, the hero's journey or a coming of age story. What is the German word for a coming of age story?
Bildungsroman.
Excellent. Bildungsroman. Excellent. Okay. I'm so happy. Okay. Um, these pages, I was telling Ginny, when we, you know, got on before you did, that these pages, for me, were among the richest of the book. And I think one of the reasons is just that element of the Bildungsroman, how we see Demon grow, and I think that that Kingsolver does, traces this growth in many ways, but in one way it's actually like an old Victorian phrase, the defining moments. So think about the reading. What are the defining moments where you could say, oh, okay, we're seeing this young boy grow. We're seeing him, come to terms with his world in an increasingly mature or different manner. So, did you find any defining moments?
I mean, he points one out when he recognizes Coach as like the only father figure he's ever had for seeing his potential.
Very good. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'll just give you one so we take a look at it. The kite scene. Remember that? When he's taking Mr. Dick outside, and there's this moment of, well, it's on. You have the book with you. It's on 210.
210. I was going to say while they're looking up that page too, and that's also a direct quote from Dickens at the top of that page that is actually in David Copperfield from Aunt Betsy says, which is a very famous line, the never be mean in anything, never be false, never be cruel, and I can always be hopeful of you. And that was her advice to David before she sent him off to school, to boarding school. And she, of course, has Mr. Dick putting that on the kite.
Look at the second to last paragraph of the chapter, and just look at the language if you have the book in front of you, and tell me what words speak to you, especially. I unlatched the back gate and wheeled him plumb out into the stubble of the hayfield behind the house. Then the going got pretty rough, wheelchair-wise, so we didn't go far, just to where I could get the runny-go I needed to send that sucker to the moon. The clouds were scooting by, throwing shadows like a herd of wild monsters rumpusing over the field, and I was right there with them. I hefted the kite and let out the string, more and more till it was not but a speck in the sky. I could feel rain starting to spit on us. And who cared? Let it thunder. The string was pulling hard in the wind, but I towed it back to Mr. Dick and put it in his hand. Hang on tight, I said, and flopped on the ground beside him, panting like a dog. He was quiet, holding that string and kite with everything he had. The way he looked, eyes raised up, body tethered by one long thread to the big stormy sky, the whole of him up there with his words, talking to whoever was listening. I've not seen a sight to match it. No bones of his had ever been shoved in a feed bag. The man was a giant. What does that show us about Demon at this stage? And think of all the kinds of all the elements that we experience as we grow. What is this showing us about him? And this is at the tail, and this is before he goes to live with the coach.
I mean, he's becoming a bit of a caretaker, like looking out for other people other than himself at this point.
Okay, that's yeah, and that's a really critical moment of one's growth, right? To go outside oneself and to help others. And then there's the character of Mr. Dick itself. So many ways, that Kingsolver could have, established the real family, right, of Demon, but it's with his grandmother and Mr. Dick, that she focuses on. Why do you think Mr. Dick is the character he is? I mean, he's obviously seriously disabled. He's, in many ways, he has to drink liquids because he has swallowing problems. Demon eventually, and I think this is kind of important, he eventually learns how to listen and to understand Mr. Dick. So why would he be? Why does I mean, this book is full of eccentric and odd characters, right? Why make Mr. Dick the kind of character that she makes him? How does that influence the way we we understand the growth of Demon?
He's almost lifted exactly like Mr. Dick within Copperfield, and I think sort of what you guys talked about a minute or two ago, like it truly shows him. It's him growing up. It's him having empathy. It's him thinking of others. It's extracting himself from what he's doing, is worrying about himself, to being sort of, not a stereotypical how he's been the last 200 pages, right?
I was sort of looking at it. It's interesting because I think he took pretty good care of his mother for most of her life till she made it, doing a lot of things for her till Stoner came along and keeping her alive. But I thought at the end of this chapter as being the start of Demon's life taking off like the kite, that they were sending him off into the world to have a whole new life. And yet there was a storm going on in the background. So saying maybe this isn't going to be as smooth as we'd like it to. There's thunder. It's not right. But the potential of, all those thoughts going off into space with the kite, that it gave them an aspiration that my life could take off and be better from here on out. And Mr. Dick also showing him that maybe that physically you might not be, in the best of shape, but doesn't mean you can't dream or have, experience something positive in your life. Because I think he thought pretty sad sack about himself. And then when he saw what Mr. Dick had been through and was able to continue, that gave him sort of a different perspective.
Yeah.
I also thought that it was Demon's way of helping Mr. Dick kind of escape his handicap, because they were his words, and now he's flying up there. It's like his kind of freedom. Because Mr. Dick's in the house, and the aunt doesn't let him, or his sister doesn't let him outside, but he got him out there, and he got the kite up there and said, "Look, your words are up there now. Here's your freedom." Because he doesn't really have the freedom. He's in a chair.
Good point. Yeah. Other?
So I'll flip the question because I'm not the English teacher, but like, he is the one character that has literally plagiarized. Like everybody else is sort of modified, tweaked, improvised, adjusted. It's fitting the 1990s situation of like, why did she completely lift him from Copperfield and put him into this? I don't know. I mean, maybe for the same reasons we're talking about. I don't know. I mean, it is crazy. I mean, like, he's completely lifted. He's completely lifted from.
Yeah.
Right. He is exactly as he is in David Copperfield. He's not anything different. Like, Betsy was an aunt, not a grandmother in David Copperfield.
Yeah.
And everybody else is sort of tweaked slightly as to who they are. You're right. And made more current, but he's exactly the person he was.
I was just reading. Yeah. I mean, like, I was looking at.
Not that I realize not everybody's done David Copperfield, but it's interesting that she did lift him just as he was. and didn't do anything else, different with him. But maybe because his character was so good as it was.
Yeah.
Because everybody listens to him, when she suggests, it's like, get the boy some clothes, do this, yes, good idea.
And well, I mean, it's sort of like, and Ginny would certainly, I'm sure, agree with me. I mean, one of the, most profound things about teaching is to be able to influence a student positively, and that's regardless of the degree to which she, stole from Dickens, there is a, a currency in what Armstrong says to the kids and tries to, to teach them, that is, I mean, it's truly, I mean, really, it's like, I just loved those sections because, like, when he spoke about stereotypes, when the fact that, of course, Kingsolver makes him black, that's and he is married to, the white artist, that adds to, to the degree to which the students can see differences and can accept differences, I think. And that's, to me, that's one of Armstrong's greatest strengths as a character. So yeah, I mean, well, what else? What do the rest of you think? I mean, I loved that character. I love that character just, because of the way he dealt with the current situations that these kids faced and that their world faced in the past, because, there was that element of denial. I mean, it's funny, I when I was reading this and reading how, people didn't really want to say view the Civil War, people in the southern part of the country didn't were reluctant. I think that's what essentially Kingsolver is saying. They're reluctant to sort of admit to the horror of the Civil War. And I was reminded, this is a little story. So when my son was about 14 or so, he's a good golfer, right? I suck as a golfer. I mean, it's just terrible. I'm terrible. I mean, I make my own rules. Like, you can't. How could you possibly take a penalty if you lose a ball? Losing the ball is the penalty. You've already lost, right? So anyway,
I like that actually.
so anyway, we were on this golf vacation on Jekyll Island, Georgia. But before there, we decided to go to Savannah. So we took a tour in the Civil War cemetery and was very, and the leader of the tour, of the group, was an undergraduate at Washington and Lee. And he, I think you'll see the connection. If not, it just might be another example of my dottiness. But he never once, well, first of all, he talked about the war of Northern oppression. He never once, and this is like over an hour, mentioned slavery. Okay, like, and so, and by this time, Brendan, my son, is like, he's seeing what's going to happen because he can see me like turning red, And I'm saying, I just find it really interesting, I said to the guy, that, you're, an educated person, and like slavery, and we're in Savannah. How, how can you not mention slavery? And by this time, Brendan is, it's like he's sort of retreating from his father, okay, because he knows this is not the end of it. And, the guys, the fellow said, well, we have a difference of opinion. I said, yeah, but you know what? Maybe it's because you lost the war. And Brendan retreated even further.
He was gone. He's like, out of there.
Oh my God, Dad, why did you? But, there is that kind of attitude that I think that Armstrong is trying to combat, in his students. And it's another way that Demon can grow, by seeing that example, right? So did that make sense? Or-
I do think in this section too, that Demon has a lot of different adults who've come into his life. What did people see from the first section of the book we read to this section? The difference in the types of adults he's now interacting with. If you think about the first part of the book, I mean, you have the Pegs that are sort of there all along, the Peggets, but the other people that have come into his life, I was wondering how you saw that affecting him, and what some of the different types were, good or bad, that he's now interacting with in this segment where he's in middle school living with Coach. Everybody's so quiet tonight.
This is where it feels like the story shifts from like Demon's getting more agency in his own life. Like the first
Excellent.
part of it was definitely the world screwing him. And you're just like, oh, this kid cannot get up. And then he shifts into this more stable environment where he has these positive role models making change. And I feel like this is where it pivots, having not read too far ahead and not knowing David Copperfield, pivots from the world screwing Demon to kind of Demon starting to screw himself and make these like bad light, like, because it shows how the cycles can continue, because you look at people kind of growing up in these environments, but he's left this bad environment, or it's not great, but he's now got stability and people that are pushing him and caring about him and trying to give him the nurturing that they see in him. So now he's got the agency to either continue the cycles or break out of the cycles, and you're starting to see that. I don't know, I was cringing through a lot of it. So yeah, I don't know.
No,
Well,
that's great. I like that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, think about it. Like, what, as we grow, what do we hopefully gain? Like, what do you see him gaining with, you've already mentioned some of it, Rachel, but what do you see him gaining as we progress?
He's definitely gaining wisdom.
Okay. Like, when do you see that?
Well, I mean, having finished the book, and
Don't go past Ethan.
yeah, I know. I'm trying to figure out a chapter again. I know. I mean, like, just in general, I mean, we all see it where he's gaining social wisdom of what's right and wrong. He's understanding that life throws you some crappy situations, but you try to get it, like, just social, physical, figuring friends out, just all that growth over life. I mean, he's that's what happens in Copperfield too, in a way. So
Linnea, what were you going to say?
I was going to say it seems like he was gaining a lot of confidence right in the beginning. And I had this huge sense of relief when he landed with Coach, because I was like, oh, this is so great. Like, his grandmother saw that he was this big, like, burly young man that might be really good at football, and he'll have like found his place in the society and he'll be able to like succeed. And so I thought it was very nice to see him in the beginning start to grow in a little bit of in a different way, even if it's just through sports, but having him have some success felt really good.
Oh, that's very good. Yeah. And you know, that brings up the question of like the significance of sports um, in that part of the world. Um, and I was talking this morning to I don't know if any of you know about this. There's a program, an organization called the Rhodes Scholars,
Yes.
and it's apparently, you know, what it really is a educational travel organization for old farts.
Yeah. Not to
And
be confused with the other road
Right.
scholars. Yes.
yeah, right. and and so I was making plans um, to travel actually to Poland with my, you know, significant other, and that's another whole story. Just briefly, because magic happens in stories like this. Um, I had not seen Ellen for 55 years. We campaigned for Eugene McCarthy, the peace candidate, in 1968, and I was dating her best friend. And she found my name somewhere and got in touch with me, and now we're you know, a serious item. And so I was making these reservations for 2 trips, one to Prague and one to Poland. And the woman I was speaking to was was from Houston, and she was talking, you know, somehow or other. And this will not surprise you when I do something as simple as trying to make a reservation, right, for a trip. It becomes like a 45-minute conversation where I tell my whole life story. Okay, so anyway, and then I could find out their whole life story. So she was, you know, I was saying, well, you know, what are your interests, like, you know? And she says, oh, well, I'm very involved in supporting high school football. Okay, and she's, you know, I mean, she's in her 20s. She doesn't have kids, but she said this is something that one does in, and she's on the outskirts of Houston, so it's sort of this rural passion for the sports, which you know, if you ever read the book Friday Night Lights or saw the film, you'll know that. And so sports definitely helps Demon to create an identity for himself, you know, and yet I love the way that Kingsolver sort of contrasts that with the difficulty of Angus's or Agnes's attempt to create, you know, sort of an intellectual team
A
for the
knowledge bowl. She would like to have the knowledge bowl and
yeah.
have an academic team. And they're like, are you nuts?
I don't, I mean,
We wouldn't spend money on that.
and it's, you know, I mean, there is you know, it is kind of a funny moment, but at the same time, it's like, wow, this is true. And, you know, just, and today, I mean, it was just like talking to this agent. She's saying that, oh, yeah, yeah. She says, this is the thing that I learned when I moved to Houston 3 years ago.
Hmm.
You know, speaking of Agnes, how do you think she affects his growth? What, and how would you describe her as a, I mean, as a character? I mean, she's one of many sort of outlier characters in this book. Um, how does she influence him? And how is she important as a character herself in this world that, you know, that we've been voyaging in?
I think she kind of leads him by showing what's important and what's not, more than football and a lot of other things that are happening in life, um, especially his past life, which has been everything as people have been doing things to him, where now he's learning to do things himself with her. It's almost a good friendship. And she's 2 years older, so I think that when she's grown up by herself, so she has gained her own personality that is above and beyond everybody else.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. There was I loved the scene when they went to Walmart and then ended up not just staying in Walmart, but they went, where else did they go to? Where I have this
He
written
went to
down.
get Nike Air Maxes that he was going
Oh,
to
I
get
know,
off
I know,
Walmart
yeah.
copies. So they went to get shoes. They went to a couple other places.
And
They
at
went to Applebee's too, right?
Mm-hmm.
there, I mean, yeah, I mean, she sort of builds this social world for him, even though she, in many ways, is not a social person, right? I mean, she's definitely isolated from others there. But there's that moment, I have it written down here, I can't find the damn thing, where she says to him, and it's right, it's when he's sort of like fretting over these things. First of all, he thought he
Pay
had to
for it.
pay for it, right? Then he finds that he doesn't, and then, you know, she's gone, you know, gone through, maybe it's this page, but
I was
it's
to say it's on like 223 where he starts talking about like, you know, fine Air Maxes he was going to get when he drops the F-bomb. And he was like, you think shoppers had never heard this before?
but it's on, it's actually the quote is on 224,
Next page.
where, you know, the next page, and he's talking to her about Maddie Kate, right? Who was, you know, essentially the housekeeper, right? And he said, should I be doing my laundry, making my lunches? Answer, no. She did all that. I told her I was pretty used to doing everything for myself, like laundry and, worst case, paying the rent. She laughed and said not to be putting her out of her job. She said mine was just to be a little boy. Weird. I'd not had that job before. It's just I mean, I think just a gorgeous um, statement about how how his whole relationship with that group, um, uh, that family, the coach, Angus, and, well, U-Haul is really not a part of the family, but yeah, go ahead. Somebody was going to say something.
I was going to say that Agnes also is very much like Demon in that she's a pretty independent soul. Like her father she has no mother. Her father is pretty much an absent father. I mean, he eats dinner with them, but he's never around, and he sort of severed her from his world in 5th grade when she tells that story about how she used to always go to practice and it was great. And then he said, this isn't a place for you anymore. And then so she just said, fine, I hate football, and forged her own world. So she and Demon both are used to being on their own. Like she does a lot of the decisions about the house, about the shopping, what to do. I mean, she has Maddie Kate obviously to cook and clean, but she goes out with, you know, the MasterCard, you know, and gets everything and sort of keeps the house running and looks after her father the way that Demon looked after her mother. His mother, I mean, looked after his mother, you know, that she sort of has to keep her father in line because he doesn't even do anything but football and, you know, drink at the dinner table and go to bed. Which
And,
is,
you know, Yeah, and so she teaches him a lot. Do you agree with that? You know,
Yeah, I
she's
do. I mean, I think she does. I think she shows him more ways that, that being independent can be beneficial, but he also teaches her, like when you get the chapter on
yeah,
Christmas, when she says,
yes,
we don't do Christmas, we're not religious. And he's like, what? No Christmas tree? You don't have to be religious to have a Christmas tree. And so he teaches her about, I mean, he's had nothing. And yet he teaches her that Christmas could be a really fun thing and you buy special presents for people, and she learns from that. So it's interesting how they're teaching each other from both of their worlds. They're not complete. Neither the one of them are living in a nuclear family with everything going right for them.
and yeah, and it's a great the present that he gets her. You know, the black hat with
Hat
the
with a
veil.
veil.
You know, and it's like it's perfect for her, right? And but even more importantly, what is his other gift for her?
Well, I think the portrait is probably the most important thing he's done for her.
Absolutely, absolutely. And which then, sort of leads us to his growth as an artist. I mean, and for anybody who, or any of the critics who say, well, this is humorless. I mean, this is just so depressing. I think in these pages, the sort of history of his artistic creation are wonderfully funny. I mean, think about how, like, I mean, because he becomes kind of an entrepreneur, right? He begins to draw for money. But what does he draw?
He draws what teenage boys will buy.
Exactly, exactly. I
He
mean,
knows his market.
I mean, God, I mean, he even gets to the point, well, yeah, yeah, I draw the bodies, they don't really need to have the heads on the bodies. That's not
Hands
necessary.
and face are extra.
But that you gotta pay
You have to pay
extra for
extra for
the hands,
that.
yeah, for the faces,
But doesn't he also have to bring the magazines home for reference?
Yes, he has to study. He needs them to get better ideas.
ex- yeah, and yet, at the same time, King Solver manages to then insinuate, you know, Annie into his life, right? And she becomes, you know, a, another kind of teacher and really teaches him, the finer points of 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 art,
and facilitates his exposure to more time with her and the genre drawing over and more time for artwork, and he really expands his horizons with her.
Absolutely, and and probably, something that Ethan mentioned earlier, that he gains wisdom, but he also not only gains knowledge, but becomes aware of the differentness of his knowledge versus other people. Can you remember how does he show that? I mean, it's really that, yes, there's life knowledge.
Right. There's the kids who know algebra and geography and, dates and things. And then he knows about, women who steal your money in a bathroom, and he knows about making meth out of the garbage dump.
Yeah, I mean, he on page 221, he says, the weirdness at the top of the page, the weirdness wasn't in what I didn't know. It's what I did know. How to watch your back at all times. What a hooker means by fun and an asshole means by discipline. And a caseworker means by we're working on it. And money, Christ. Watching these kids pull it out of their pockets in fistfuls of fives or ones or tens, holding out the whole wad for the lunch lady to pick through like they don't know the difference or don't care. outside at recess, betting and losing actual quarters over utterly ignorant shit, like who holds his breath longest, or will that bee fly up Miss Wall's dress and sting her twat? What stood between this pack of blind puppies and me was the education of how many batteries drained, bags of garbage hauled, hours clocked in and out makes the difference between a oneer and a 10. I was inked with the shit prints of life, thrashings, lies told, days of getting pieced out on weed, months of going hungry. I didn't want to be like these other kids. And that to me is such a, it's just a, such an honest self evaluation, right? I don't want to be like them. And before there was, there was the I mean, well, there was almost the constant realization of how much he lacks, and this is such an example of how much he now is self-aware and realizes how much he has.
And all along, he recognizes deficiencies in other people. His
Yes.
father's behavior, U-Haul, Maggot, they're different, and he doesn't want to be like them, but he describes characteristics that he wants to avoid.
Yeah. And then it's interesting too that Jenny and I were also talking about this when Mr. Pegg asked him, well, what do I do about, he doesn't call him Maggot, but what do I do about Maggot? I mean, and he essentially has no comment and said, well, I don't really understand him, but there is that acceptance, right? There's I think the acceptance of Maggot's otherness, I mean, and sometimes that otherness is very, pretty comical, when he's cautioned against taking the expensive makeup, right? And but by the same token, there's this kind of overall acceptance, and it's all built. I mean, I think that Kingsolver, she's doing it through the classroom, through the realization of that well, we have a black teacher from Chicago who was married to a white hippie, who both of whom give him such depth of experience, and I think that she melds that really, Kingsolver melds that really well. All right. I've asked a whole hell of a lot of questions. I want you to think about what we're talking about, and I want to hear from you. You're on the spot, and I can be really patient. My former students may remember that at times, if there was no response in the classroom, I would always have a crossword puzzle next to me, and I would just start working on the crossword puzzle until somebody had something to say. So your turn.
I was struck by, I mean, how, like we've been talking about how this kind of cast of characters around him were so diverse and unique, and he never went through an awkward like rejection of anybody, especially when he like became, he goes into his football jock phase and he doesn't turn against like weird Maggot friend, and I love that about it, but then part of me was also frustrated that it seemed almost unrealistic that a kid would be so good through and through and not go through some sort of phase of like trying to fit in at school or something.
That's a really interesting point, Elizabeth.
yeah, I mean, I was proud of him as I'm reading it, but then I'm thinking, this is a choice that she made, and it was hard for me to believe that that he was like that, I guess. He felt like a little bit like a pinball, just getting like bounced around in a pinball machine with all these things happening to him and crazy influences, and he was so steady through the whole thing.
That's a great point. How did the rest of you respond to that? To Elizabeth's point.
I mean, a little bit, I thought he got knocked around so much, it made him more resilient and actually be that kind of kid because he was almost beat up so much that he was a better person for it. So I kind of thought like he adapted more because he'd have been like kind of abused through the rest of it, like just someone who's more compromising in life.
Yeah, I thought the same thing. I figured he was just much more accepting of people how they are, just because of, so he's just seen so much, and that he doesn't shy away from people being different.
And I think it's interesting that because you use the word unrealistic, and Elizabeth, and I thought about that too. But I guess the other side of it is that we're dealing with a character for all of his faults, flaws, weaknesses, is extraordinary in some ways, and that kind of resilience that is mentioned more than once. I mean, I guess for me it's sort of like, yeah, I get it. I get it. He's been through the school of hard knocks his whole damn life. And either he can resent it, right? And and resent that world, or as he builds again this sort of self-esteem, confidence, and identity. I mean, that the visit to his grandmother, I think, was also very, very important to establish the identity. I mean, he goes to his father's grave, right? He goes to his father's grave, and he realizes that he is part of a family. And I think that's such a an important element, because even when he was with his mom, yeah, I mean, he was really, as you pointed out, the caregiver, right? He was, he was the one who was taking care of her, but in terms of having, a concept of of family that is his and his alone, right? I mean, yeah, I mean, pegs were great, right? But they're not his, right? And when he sees where the hell do I have that written? Oh, okay, I think it's on page 199. Well,
While you're looking that up, I think the other thing too is he's always waiting for the other shoe to drop. He never completely believes anybody's going to keep him. And he mentions that several times in these chapters that, I won't be here that long, or it'll be time for me to go. And like when Christmas came, he's like, that's the time people start thinking about their real family and they're not going to want me. And so I think sometimes he stays nice with everybody because he's constantly feels he may be on the way back down. He never feels like he's so far up in the social chain that he can afford to cut himself off from everybody else, because he does believe people are going to leave him, and he's going to be moved to another family. And as much as he likes what's happening now, because he knows his grandmother doesn't want him. I mean, as much as she's blood family and Mr. Dick is blood family, they don't want him living with them because she doesn't want boys. So he doesn't really have any blood family that wants him for their own. Even the Peggotts are really the only ones. And even when he thought they would take him, they wouldn't take him. So he's always got that. I feel like he's always waiting for somebody to kick him out. And he, in these chapters we read this time, he mentions that several times about, I could be leaving any time now, sort of right up until the end when the coach says to him, you've got something. And I think, you could be anything. And also, just catching towards the end of the last couple chapters here where he runs into fast forward again and he meets Rose Darnell and he meets Mouse at the 4th of July party and some of these other people. Like, here he was moving towards this group I thought was going to be a better influence. And suddenly, here comes this other crew back in at 4th of July saying, oh, hey, where have you been? These people that are not the best people in the world. And I have to say, about the funny stuff, one of the funniest lines I thought was when that Mouse said, oh, here comes Mrs. Robinson and Elaine. And of course, he had no idea, Demon Copperhead, what she was talking about.
Exactly.
And I thought, yeah, like he's seen The Graduate, like he's ever seen a movie, this poor kid. But that, there are moments of humor like that. That and the other humorous thing I meant to mention that I loved, I mentioned this to you, Peter, was when he thought Agnes was a boy and all the things he said to her. And he's just going on and on. Oh, JV football. Yeah, there's room on the bench for everybody. It doesn't matter how skinny, small you are.
And then he's dying afterwards.
Dying when he realizes every stupid thing he said.
What did I say to him? Oh my God.
Yeah.
The quote I was looking at is on 199. It's right when he, this is well before he sees his father's grave, but it's when when she tells him, would you just go take a bath? In the end, I figured I'd probably live and be the better for a good soak. Given the days of shit I needed to get off my skin, I ran the water. I held my breath. I stepped in, eased my butt down to the deepest water I'd ever got into. And we remember his fear, although he knows he could never drown. But even so, sat there naked and not dead, letting a boatload of new info soak into my brain. My whole lifetime of having nobody, claiming a pretend mama, getting kicked to the back of every line while people with kin looked after their own. That was all a lie. I had my own. It's a lot to turn over all at once. I had no idea what came next. Maybe nothing more for my trouble than some hand-me-down shoes. But still, I had my father's name. These people looked like me and had money. You had to think. I mean, that house. It's such such a moment for him. I think when he realizes all of that, and it's not a realization that he's had before. That he can look at that and say, okay, I am part of this family. This is who I am, even though grandma doesn't want him there because he's a boy. And what did you make of that whole element of it? That she had raised 11 girls who had come from obviously bad situations, and I mean, the only guy she really apparently gets along with is Mr. Dick.
It felt like a funhouse mirror version of Miss Havisham from like a different Dickens novel. Who some weird thing about people that hate boys, because Miss Havisham raised Stella to like
Stella, yeah,
to terrible hate boys, tear them apart, do all this bad stuff,
ruin their lives as best as she could.
Yeah, so it's like a similar vibe. Like one is just evil and the other is not. I don't. That's I guess being a bit genre savvy, knowing that it's a Dickens, so looking at other characters from different books. But I couldn't help but notice some parallels there in a weird funhouse.
Great. I hadn't thought about that till you mentioned it, Rachel. But that's a great insight. I do think, it's the whole thing, boys are nothing but trouble. Boys stuffed her brother in a bag when he was, little and did horrible things to him. And my son was nothing but trouble. He ran away and he left me. And, and then right when we were going to reconcile, he gets killed. So she's had nothing but bad experiences, with boys. I'm not sure what happened with her husband, but he was gone, and Mr. Dick's the only guy in her life, so I think she's just decided men are trouble and girls are just easier to deal with, They do their homework. I love the scene at the Walmart where U-Haul's coming and they're waiting and they're out there and the girl's doing her homework. And he says, what is it with girls? Like they're always doing their homework, no matter what. I think just the whole idea that boys were trouble.
Yeah.
But it does seem a little unrealistic. I feel like if she's opened herself up to, raising 12 girls at different points, that
Yeah.
like she has this grandson who at that point is young enough to be influenced and like clearly desperate and has had a horrible upbringing thus far. It seems a little unrealistic that she's just like, oh, I'm going to ship you off.
Okay, that another interesting point. Yeah, I was surprised. I remember when I first read the book, I thought, oh, okay, well, this is good. Thank God he's finally found a place where people want him.
And that actually, she twisted that differently from Dickens, because in David Copperfield, he stays with them and they do want him and they keep him until he's old enough that he has to go to school, that she realizes she can't do enough for him education wise and sends him off to school. But he lives with Betsy and Mr. Dick and they're all very, very happy together.
And so from the point of view of, say, the author, right?
Yeah.
Why do you think? Well, nothing has to be, but why does Kingsolver think he has to be rejected there?
Right. That's an interesting choice she's making, that he's rejected, not like you're old enough.
Choice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it might have been unrealistic. Yeah, as you said, Lene, that what she did, how she helped these women, and yet how could he's her
blood. He's her grandson, and she wouldn't let him go.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, this could be a last question, obviously, because some of us have read Copperfield and not. Like, do you guys know Doc and Dick? Do you know actually from doing like the course analysis and creating this, like why Kingsolver say facsimile Mr. Dick, but then tweaked what you just said, Ginny, but then back to what Elizabeth said of like he's able to go to each friendly circle, which is because like in Copperfield, he's not left. He wanders around and sees everybody the whole time. Like, so she does parallel Copperfield. She does tweak some characters, tweak some situations, but do you guys know why she did what she did just from studying the book?
I think she tried to make some of it her own, obviously. She knew she was taking a story and rewriting it. And I think she made different choices. I can't speak for her as to why she made certain choices, but I think she definitely, in the way she wanted the story to proceed and end, she made choices, I think, to change some, characters are all essentially the same, but change them and make little tweaks to advance the story to where she was going with it.
Yeah.
That would just be my thought, but I can't get in her head.
Yeah.
It is 8:47 too, just to remind you, we should be wrapping up.
I think the thing that I mean, Dickens is a
Just
great.
make a point.
Yeah.
I have a concern that things are going too well for him right now. At the point where we stopped at this chapter, he's
good.
His idol had been the light that was shining on him and gave him recognition, and now he's getting recognition on his own, where people are talking to him and don't even know the old guys, and they enjoy seeing him around and want to hear his stories. And he has a job on the side that's paying him good money, and he's not working that hard, and meets people and has interesting conversations. So I have the feeling, in light of what's happened before, that something bad's going to happen. He's got some drug exposure. Is that going to get worse? The people
and
the characters.
The hints are being placed, right? And the other thing too is that she might have wanted. I think that 19th century writers, the Victorians or some of the Romantic writers, even though there were big moments of surprise and so forth in the way they drew their characters, there was more of a linear progression with them. And I think she's fighting that. You know, that she's fighting. In other words, the way people grow is not linearly. There are these dips, and and at some of the best moments, you're just waiting for something to collapse, right? I mean, and I think that's one of the reasons why she has that particular unexpected or surprising response from the grandmother, because essentially, she's you know she's rejected him, but then, if you want to look at the other side of it, but she actually places him in a good place,
I think it's also just
where he'd be much better off, right? I mean, he's joining this young, Agnes. He's joining it's a football coach. I mean, so what seems, so there's that up and down, that fluidity. So it looks as though, like, oh my God, how could she do that? But then again, what the hell is he going to be doing if he remained with her? Right? I mean,
Elizabeth, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to say that geographically, it keeps him intertwined with the people that he's known
Right.
forever, the Peggotts and
Exactly.
Maggot,
Very good.
and being able to interact with Fast Forward again later and all these guys. If he had stayed with his grandmother, it would have been like a whole other cast of characters and a different school and everything. So
That's right, because he
I think
goes
she
back to Lee
physically had
County.
to, yeah. she
Puts
had
him
to
in Lee
leave.
County and not in Tennessee where she is.
And he doesn't, I mean, this is the thing, is he returns to his world, but that world has transformed upon his return. Okay, well, that's a good, yep, I'm glad you got a little bit chattier there. That was very good.
Chapters 40 to 52 for next week.
Yep. And we'll see you then. I hope you all had good Thanksgivings.
Yes. It was great to see everybody, and we'll see you next week. Thanks so much for tuning in.
We'll
Thanks,
see you.
guys.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys.
Bye-bye.